Why did all great empires, from Rome to the Soviet Union, end up following the same script? Economic crisis, loss of trust, and paper money. Coincidence? Or is there a hidden pattern built into the very system of power? Today, we will trace the path of empires that began printing money and almost immediately began to disappear. And perhaps we will understand why our world is repeating the same steps. Great empires do not collapse because of external enemies. They often perish because they begin to change their very essence. They destroy the very fabric on which they were built. Trust. And the most subtle but deadly tool of this destruction is money. More precisely, paper money. This seems trivial. Isn't paper money just a convenient tool? It's lighter than coins. It can be printed. It can be used to pay soldiers and build cities. It weighs nothing and gives freedom of maneuver. But behind this convenience lies treachery. Paper money is a promise, and an empire that begins to live on promises alone will sooner or later begin to die. If you look at history, the pattern is frighteningly repetitive. A great power reaches its peak, faces a crisis, and at that moment makes a fateful decision: to introduce paper money. The decision seems reasonable. It is temporary. It is supposedly needed for the duration of reforms or for military purposes. But time passes and paper money remains. And the longer it remains in circulation, the weaker the system that created it becomes. Economists argue, is this the cause of collapse or its consequence? Perhaps paper money appears when there are no other options left. But then another question arises. Why do they all lead to the same outcome? The disappearance of the empire. Perhaps paper money is not the cause, but a symptom. A symptom that the elite can no longer control an economy based on real value. That it is more convenient for them to create the illusion of value and sell it to the people. But this illusion has an expiry date. First comes inflation, then hyperinflation, then mistrust. And mistrust kills everything: the army, trade, morality, faith in the future. If you look closely, you can find a moment in almost every great civilization when paper money appeared. Sometimes it was banknotes, sometimes it was IOUs, sometimes it was treasury notes, assignats, government bonds. The name is not important. What is important is that they are no longer backed by anything but faith. And that faith always cracks. And then the countdown begins. The empire may still exist. Armies may still march. Senates may still sit. And speeches may still be made. But there is no foundation beneath them. Paper money becomes an invisible marker of the end. It is as if history itself is stamping, "This system is doomed." In the following chapters, we will see this with specific examples. We will visit ancient Rome, where emperors debased silver, creating money out of thin air. We will look at China, where the first paper money gave rise to the first hyperinflation. We will travel to France during the Revolution, to Weimar Germany, to the USSR, and further, to our age of digital currencies. Because perhaps we ourselves are already living in the last act of our empire. When we think of the fall of the Roman Empire, images of barbarians destroying walls, Traitors in the Senate and burned cities come to mind. But the real decline began much earlier and looked much quieter. It started with a coin, with the denarius. The denarius was the basis of the Roman monetary system. It was a silver coin introduced during the Republic. It was so reliable and stable that it was accepted throughout the empire, from Britain to Syria. And as long as the denarius retained its weight, minting and silver content, the empire prospered. But with each new crisis, Rome spent more and more on the army, the court, entertainment, and wars. And so the rulers began to resort to trickery. At first, it was almost imperceptible. The coin was made slightly lighter. More copper was added to the alloy. It was polished to make it shine like before. The people still believed. The emperor was still depicted on them, and they still bore the Roman seal. A generation passed, and the denarius contained almost no silver. In appearance, it was the same coin. In reality, it was counterfeit. The state began to deceive its people, and this deception infected everything. The army began to demand more money. Merchants raised prices. The provinces refused to pay taxes with the old coins. Inflation begins in Rome. To save the economy, new forms of payment are introduced. Treasury receipts, promissory notes, even notes resembling paper money. All these are desperate attempts to keep the system afloat. But the ship is already sinking. Historians have long debated why such a powerful empire fell. Was it moral decay? The invasion of barbarians? The division between East and West? All of these factors played a role. However, many researchers increasingly point to financial collapse. When citizens lose faith in money, they lose faith in the state. By the 4th century AD, Rome had become a sham. Imperial decrees no longer meant anything because the treasury could not pay for them. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern fragment of Rome, drew the conclusion. There, they kept a stable gold coin, the solidus, for much longer. And it was the Eastern Empire that lasted 1,000 years longer. Money there was real, and trust was maintained. And so was power. Rome lost the war without a fight. It destroyed its own economy. It began to pay its soldiers with counterfeit coins, and the soldiers stopped defending it. It began to collect taxes in a devalued currency, and the provinces began to revolt. It destroyed the very foundation, trust in the state. And when the barbarians came, all they had to do was take what was already dead. The empire fell, but the lesson remained. Where coins lose their weight, the throne collapses. Where money becomes a promise rather than a value, the end is near. And Rome is only the first in a long line of examples. When Europe was still debating whether it was possible to draw perspective, China was already printing money. Literally. It was there, in the Middle Kingdom, that paper banknotes were first officially introduced in the world. At first glance, it was a revolution. In reality, it was the first harbinger of an economic nightmare that would later be repeated in dozens of countries. The first paper money appeared during the Song dynasty, around the 11th century AD. It was a time of rapid growth. Trade expanded, cities grew rich, and silk, tea, and porcelain were sold for thousands of lei. Transporting bags of coins became unprofitable. This led to the emergence of jiaozi, the first state-issued paper money, which replaced heavy metal currency. It was convenient, official, and guaranteed by the government. This is where the first pitfall arises. Paper money seems like a neutral and useful invention, but its essence lies in trust. And when the authorities begin to abuse this trust, the mechanism collapses. At first, paper money in China really worked. It was trusted and accepted. But the more the state printed, the more it printed. The silver and gold backing remained a promise, while in reality, the number of banknotes grew and their purchasing power declined. Inflation began. During the Yuan dynasty, founded by the Mongols after their conquest of China, paper money reached catastrophic proportions. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, needed funds to rule his vast empire. He printed banknotes in unlimited quantities. It was the first fully paper-based economy in history, with no silver or gold backing. Genius? In the short term, yes. But very soon, the population lost faith in paper money. Riots broke out, rebellions, and the Yuan dynasty collapsed. As early as the 14th century, the new rulers, the Ming, tried to reintroduce paper currency. They even made huge banknotes the size of a book page. But the lesson was forgotten. Again, there was hyperinflation. And again, financial collapse. The Chinese remembered for centuries to come, paper money cannot be trusted. In some regions, people later even refused to accept banknotes, preferring silver or rice. It is important to understand that China was ahead of everyone else. It was the first to experience how paper money could boost the economy, and how quickly it could destroy it. And in each cycle, the same pattern repeated itself. Crisis, printing press, brief upturn, collapse. Paper money in China became a symbol of instability. And yet, it was the greatest power of its time. It had everything: an army, science, culture, technology. But it lacked one thing: restraint. And when trust disappeared, so did the dynasty. Today, many countries are following the same path. And although technology has changed, the essence remains the same. If the government can print whatever it wants, it will. And it will pay for it. A generation later. Or sooner. The French Revolution changed the whole world, seemingly towards freedom, equality, and brotherhood. But few remember that one of the main reasons for its bloody turn was paper money. It was called assignats and became a symbol not only of financial collapse, but also of the moral decay of the new state. When the royal power in France collapsed, the country urgently needed money. The treasury was empty. War was raging. The economy was at a standstill, and crowds were rioting in Paris. The National Assembly decided to issue a new form of money: assignats. These banknotes were supposedly backed by land confiscated from the church. Formally, it was a guarantee, but in reality, it was nothing but hot air. The first issue of assignats was successful. The people accepted them. The promises worked. But very soon, the government began to print more. And then even more. There was not enough land, but money was printed anyway. All for the sake of saving the republic. Prices rose. Bread became more expensive. Food disappeared. Inflation began. But the authorities continued to assure everyone that everything was under control. Decrees were issued prohibiting speculation. Punishments were introduced for refusing to accept banknotes. Even the death penalty was imposed for attempting to trade for gold or silver. Monetary coercion became political. Soon, banknotes lose their credibility. People begin to secretly save their money in coins, silver, and jewelry. A black market emerges. Society is divided. Some have paper money, others have real assets. And those with real assets gradually become enemies of the new regime. Parallel to inflation, radicalism grew. Revolutionaries began to look for someone to blame. The nobility, priests, conspirators, bankers. The guillotine worked non-stop. Economic collapse turned into political terror. Money disappeared, and with it, freedom. Robespierre and his entourage create a society of fear. There is hunger in the streets, fear in the homes, and worthless paper in people's pockets. France, which dreamed of justice, got chaos. And it all started with the decision to print money to save the country. When Napoleon came to power, his first act was to destroy the assignats and bring back metal currency. He understood that no army would stand for a piece of paper that no one would accept the next day. No state can survive if its money is just a promise against a backdrop of deficit and despair. The French Revolution is often described as a struggle for new ideas, but at its core was economic panic, and paper money became an instrument of that panic. It gave the illusion of salvation, but became an accelerator of destruction. The revolution devoured its children, but the assignats were the first spoonful. This was a lesson for all of Europe, and for the future. But, as history would show, it was not learned. In the next chapter, we will see how Germany in the 20th century went down the same path, with the same result, only on a more terrifying scale. After the First World War, Germany lay in ruins, political, moral, and economic. The empire had collapsed. The Kaiser had fled, and the country had become a republic. But the republic was born in debt. There were reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, a ruined industry, and millions of destitute soldiers. The Weimar Republic sought a way out, and, like many before it, it chose paper money. At first, the solution seemed obvious. To pay reparations and rebuild the country, more money was needed. And to get more money, it had to be printed. Printing presses ran day and night. New marks came into circulation by the millions, then by the billions. First, they were used for the needs of the state. Then, they were used to pay salaries. Then, they were used simply to keep the money in circulation. Inflation began as a shadow. No one noticed it. Prices rose slightly, but that was normal after the war. But then, like a snowball, it became uncontrollable. By the end of 1922, prices were rising not by the day, but by the hour. In 1923, by the minute. People were paid twice a day. They didn't take their wages home. They rushed straight to the shops while the money was still worth something. A cup of coffee in a cafe could cost 1,000 marks in the morning and 100,000 in the evening. Banknotes were used as wallpaper, toys, and cigarette wrappers. They were literally worthless. Banks couldn't cope. Trolleys full of money became part of city life. Security guards escorted not gold bars, but boxes of worthless paper. And that paper no longer meant anything. People lost faith in the state, in the economy, in the future. And again, as in France, economic collapse led to political radicalism. The far right and far left took to the streets. Populists promised order, stability, and an iron fist. And in this chaos, a man appeared who offered a simple solution: remove the old elite, restore pride, and punish those responsible. His name was Adolf Hitler. Many historians are convinced that without hyperinflation, there would have been no Third Reich. If it weren't for the millions of people who lost everything because of paper money, no one would have handed over power to the radicals. But inflation destroyed more than just the economy. It destroyed trust, and that made the monstrous possible. By the end of 1923, Germany introduced a new currency, the rent mark, backed by land and industry. Inflation stopped. But trust was lost, and it was never restored. 10 years later, the country went up in flames again. This time not economic, but literal. The Weimar Republic is a classic example of what happens when a state thinks it can print its way out of its problems. Paper money provided a brief respite, and became a false hope that drowned an entire nation. And this was not the last manifestation of this pattern. In the next chapter, we will move to the Soviet Union, a country that also abandoned the gold standard and chose the path of a centralized paper ruble. Let's see how that story ended. The Soviet Union did not simply abandon the market economy. It attempted to build a completely new world, a world where money played no role, where ideas, not profits, were paramount. But in practice, even ideology needs a budget. And when the treasury is empty, ideology becomes secondary. Money becomes primary, especially if it is paper money. After the Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks initially abolished money altogether. They announced that buying and selling would be replaced by direct distribution. But by 1920, it was clear that the country was collapsing. The army was starving. Factories were at a standstill. People were resorting to barter. Money was needed, and it was brought back, in the form of the Soviet ruble. At first, they tried to peg the ruble to gold. In 1924, they even issued the chervonaise, supposedly a gold currency. But it was gold in name only. Real gold was kept in reserves, and most transactions were conducted in paper rubles, which were not backed by anything. Over the years, the system became increasingly centralized. A planned economy did not need real prices. Salaries were set, prices were approved, and the ruble was printed. The state could issue as much money as it needed, and as long as oil, gas, and weapons brought in foreign currency, the system held. But internally, decay was setting in. People received salaries but could not buy goods. Money accumulated in savings accounts but was worthless. A paradox arose. The population had money but no confidence in it. Everything was decided by connections, barter, and bribery. Soap, jeans, canned food, and alcohol became the real currency. The paper ruble remained, but it was worthless. By the end of the 1980s, shortages were widespread. The state continued to print money, hoping to solve the distribution problems. But the more they printed, the less it was worth. The ruble fell even within the country. People tried to save dollars, exchange currency for gold, and stock up on scarce goods. Money lost its meaning as a measure of value, as a medium of exchange, and as a symbol of the state. When the USSR collapsed, no one was surprised. Years before the official collapse, it had become clear that the system was unviable. It could not guarantee bread. It could not provide jobs. It could not give people a future. Because there was nothing behind the paper ruble. No economy, no trust, no faith. Many analysts believe that it was the financial collapse that led to the downfall of the Union. Not the arms race, not ideological conflict, but the loss of internal values, primarily monetary ones. Money became empty, and the country followed suit. In the next and final chapter, we will look at the present day. We will find out if history is repeating itself only on a global scale. Paper dollars, digital assets, and a world where money is created out of thin air, based on promises that are increasingly difficult to keep. The world has changed. Paper money no longer rustles in our pockets. It glows as numbers on screens. We live in an age of virtual transactions, digital wallets, and banking apps. But the essence remains the same. Money is a promise. And when there are too many promises, they lose their value. Today, humanity is following the same path as Rome, France, and the USSR. Only the footsteps have become quieter. In 1971, the United States of America finally abandoned the gold standard. From that moment on, the dollar ceased to be backed by gold. It became pure debt, a debt obligation backed by trust. Many economists consider this date a turning point. From that moment on, the world economy entered a new phase, the phase of fiat currencies. Fiat money is money without physical backing. Its value is based solely on trust in the issuer. And when the issuer is a state mired in debt, with a budget deficit and ever-growing obligations, that trust begins to crack. Since the early 2000s, central banks around the world have been printing money on a massive scale. First, to support the economy after the crisis. Then, to save the banks. Then, to finance anti-crisis measures. After the COVID-19 pandemic, this practice reached its peak. Trillions of dollars and euros were literally created out of thin air. Yes, inflation has slowed down. Yes, markets have adapted. But behind the outward calm lies the same tension that existed in the days of banknotes, marks, and rubles. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency, but its purchasing power is gradually declining. People are investing in gold, real estate, cryptocurrencies. All of this is an attempt to escape the risk of paper money. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, have become a new hope, or a new threat. They promise convenience, transparency, and control. But behind this lies absolute centralization. If money is just a string of code that can be reset, frozen, or changed, does that mean we are returning to a system where power determines value, not the market? Some analysts say we are already in a new empire, the empire of the dollar. But it is repeating the same mistakes. It prints money. It makes promises. It maintains trust through artificial means. And that means that at some point, the cycle will repeat itself. Perhaps this is no coincidence. Perhaps paper money, and now digital money, is truly built into the code of decline. It does not create crises. It merely signals that a crisis is already underway. It is like the light at the end of the tunnel. Only this light is not from the exit, but from an approaching train. History shows that no great power has ever survived its financial illusion. And if today's states think they can defeat mathematics with promises, they should reread history. From Rome to the CIA, from the denarius to the dollar. Or maybe we are the last generation that still remembers that money was once real.